So welcome everyone to the 2023 edition of the Diatom Web Academy. I'd like to encourage everyone to check our news postings on diatoms.org. We have job announcements, postdoc fellowships, articles, course announcements, and contact us with your news items for posting on diatoms.org. I'd be glad to put those up. Our next seminar in 2 weeks will be on Tuesday, February 14th, and Dave Harwood at University of Nebraska will be speaking on the great grandmother diatoms. So be sure to tune in for a great talk. And I'd like to now introduce today's speaker, Dr. Marco Cantonati, who is a senior assistant professor at University of Bologna. Marco's research interests are in freshwater ecology, taxonomy, benthic algae, biodiversity, climate and environmental change, long-term ecological research, and of course, spring habitats. He has over 275 publications. He's described genera and species of algae and cyanobacteria. And he is author of one of the most widely used diatom identification texts. So we are really pleased to have Marco today. And he will be speaking on spring habitats as living repositories of biodiversity. So thank you, Marco, and go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for the nice introduction. And yes, I was reflecting now that it's time passes quickly. It's now 3 decades that I am trying to understand the biodiversity, especially the diatom biodiversity of these intriguing habitats, the springs, better. And this talk will be about springs, not only diatoms, but of course we will try to bring in the diatoms whenever it's useful and interesting, very often. And here you can see, of course, my affiliation, but I put this large banner of the International Society for Diatom Research and also the link to the website, because I think it's worth remembering on every occasion that there is this association, which is very important for whomever thinks she wants to start to develop a career in as professional or scientist in diatom studies, research, environmental assessments. This society, when I joined it, I think it was 93. It used to be pretty large with several hundreds of members, and it's in good health even now, but this number of members declined for different reasons. For example, molecular people focused on molecular topics are attending other societies and meetings. So I think it's important to let people know it exists and it offers a range of possibilities. But let's come to our topic and our talk. And so the goal, what I would like to do in this presentation, in this talk, I hope to have quite a lot of time, but in the end, they told me it's strategic not to use too much, and I will try to keep it in 45 minutes because several attendees only have an hour, and that's understandable. So what I will try to do in this 45 minutes is offer an overview on the especially diatom biodiversity of these very special systems that we will try to define better during the change. Of course, I will try to define the features of diatom biodiversity in springs, conservation challenges, and also show a little bit how this biodiversity can be used to gain information on these systems. a little bit of context, well, the unfrozen fresh water represents only 0.9. It's not even 1% of the Earth's water volume. So a really tiny fraction, but a very important fraction because, for example, it allows us to survive, to live. But it is also very important for biodiversity. This tiny fraction hosts, is a shelter, a shrine for 7% of global biodiversity. These are all, of course, estimates, but for what we know till now, this small fraction of the Earth's water hosts 7% of all described species on Earth. Here on the bottom of the slide, you can see it's a nice summary. I use it often. I like this. It's when John Downing was president of ESLO, in his presidential address at the ESLO SIL meeting, he summarized in 10 points the main topics, issues in limnology, in freshwater science. And we will have a chance to mention almost all of them during the talk, especially those highlighted in yellow. But let's come to the springs. So the practical scientific hydrogeological definition is very easy. It's any localized place where groundwater comes to surface. But there is a lot of misunderstanding, especially if we go to even among scientists, and especially if we go to a non-specialized, non-academic public. And that's because we now use English as lingua franca of scientific communication. That's not very favorable to springs because in English, if you think or you say spring, probably what most people who are not related to engineering and to mechanics will think is the season, so spring season. I remember myself as being introduced to a colleague years ago, to a famous colleague, and the person introducing me was saying he's a spring biologist, and this colleague said, oh, so he likes to sample only in spring. And that is the second thing people will think of is the mechanical part, the spring. And only the third meaning will be the habitat. And in most cases, it's people are not thinking really about habitat ecosystems, but they are thinking about some capturing device that allows water to come into the municipality aqueduct, water supply system. So if we go to try to offer a summary of scientific definition of springs, it's I already remembered the simple and practical one, which is the basis. And then I mentioned here a number of points. I can be very quick on several of these because there will be special slides on these these points. But the ones highlighted in yellow, I should try to develop them a little bit here. So springs, we will see it, are facing many impacts. And there is a demise, a decline of springs, which is very worrying, and is probably also a global crisis. And if they survive as important habitats, it's because they are very numerous. There are estimates, and estimates say that, or these calculations provide figures of this, that there might be on average on Earth, excluding Antarctica, 3 springs per square kilometer. That would make a global total of 45 million springs on Earth. So it could be up to 50, or depends on how correct this. It's of course very difficult to upscale what we know on spring distribution to the largest scale possible on the planet. And there are probably estimated global total of 100,000 thermal springs. So these points, heterogeneity, biodiversity, hotspots, we will mention later on. And springs can be considered keystone ecosystems, and this is not so obvious in mesic climates, but if you go to many parts of the earth with arid climate, arid lands, several places, for example, in the southwest of the United States, their role as keystone ecosystems emerges a lot. For example, also animals you would not relate to springs, like bighorn sheep. They are linked or in an important way to these environments, because the females, or older females that lead the herds, they know where the springs are, and they lead the herds regularly to these systems for watering. And there are even birds that are real butterflies related to springs. And of course, the aquatic fauna and flora that we will mention later. They provide many ecosystem services. Clean water is probably most obvious one, but they have exceptional levels of, this is not much known, but exceptional levels of biological productivity. So think maybe Arizona, or I think also Colorado, in similar states. They have on average in the landscape biological productivity, let's say between 5 and 10 grams per square meter per year. And Odum, in his classical work of 1953, in the 50s, early 50s, on Silver Springs in Florida, he measured probably the highest productivity values ever measured. They are as high as 6 kilograms per square meter per year, so it's 1,000 times more. Incredible biological productivity, providing important keystone ecosystems, ecosystem services. And of course, unfortunately, especially in the Western culture, we don't have a spiritual connection to these sites as many other cultures have. And we see them more as a commodity and try to use them also as an economic good. I will only mention all the water battling operations. That's a huge business, probably worth between $5 and $10 billion per year. So in the United States, people still drink 50 million bottles of water, mostly labeled as spring water, per day. So ecosystem services, economics, and an important concept that we developed, it was already present in the literature, but in a there were only 4 papers mentioning it, not really defining it. We wrote this paper in 2020, this opinion paper, to launch it. And it's Ecohydrogeology. This is a unifying discipline, integrating approaches typical on one hand of ecology and on the other hand of hydrogeology, in the study of groundwater dependent organisms, habitat and ecosystems to advance stewardship, science, of course, and policy. You see this, you have seen also in the previous slide, these hourglass models, which I used all over my career in several publications, developing them more and more. And you see that indeed they point out that the spring is the meeting point between an aquifer and a surface freshwater system. And so as meeting point, that's what in ecology we call an ecotone, and it's multiple ecotone because it's an ecotone between groundwater and surface water, between land and water, and between, if it's a connected spring to the surface running water system, between the spring head, spring mouth, and the spring-fed stream or lake. So multiple ecotones, but others prefer to see them as ecosystems. As I said, Odum did the first ecosystem ecology work in a spring, but this is a very special spring. It has many cubic meters per second of discharge. It generates a river, a lake, and in the spring head, and then a river. And it looks like a lake. You can see it here also in the small image. And so it's easy to think of these large system, Montezuma well, and the terrific thermal springs in Yellowstone in Wyoming. It's relatively easy to think of these systems more as ecosystems, and it's also correct, of course. I prefer, I think, or I don't know if I prefer it really, but I think the ecosystem vision is probably more exact, but that's a matter of opinions. And for others, springs are groundwater, or the most characteristic even groundwater dependent ecosystem. Here again, in my view, I can agree with this, but more precisely, in my view, the spring is where the groundwater, for example, in a petrifying spring, the real spring is the spring head where water comes to daylight, and you have this very special condition in that case of degazing of CO2 that causes the precipitation of carbonates. But in the spring-dependent ecosystem is in that case the limestone deposit that usually is some meters downstream from the spring. Or to choose some simpler examples, it could be a spring-fed lake or a spring-fed stream. That's the groundwater dependent ecosystem, and the spring would be the ecotone, multiple ecotone feeding or generating these groundwater dependent ecosystems. But of course, you can see also the spring itself as a groundwater dependent ecosystem. So we tend to approach spring in the Western culture to exploit it, to use it for some benefit, mostly for the water, as drinking water, to water cattle. And but in most cultures, and also in our ancient Western cultures like the Greek, the Romans, they were also places of high spirituality and sacred places. They were windows to the other world. The Greeks and the Romans, they had special gods or nymphs connected to the springs. The Romans, even the name Fons means fountain spring. So there was a god especially dedicated to these systems. And in North America, they had the horned serpent or the water serpent that has many attributes. Some are very funny, but we don't have time to remember those. But the important thing, he delivers the water, brings the water from the ground to the surface. And springs, since we think of them mainly from the standpoint of exploitation, they suffer many impacts, and most important impacts are groundwater exploitation, groundwater pumping, overdraft. Of course, that can be viewed, if not the whole water of a spring is used as flow diversion, but often it really is a complete use of the water of a spring with habitat destruction. Because to take the water according to hygienic rules, you have to dig down to the bedrock, you have to make concrete boxes where you have basins concrete basins for decantation, for sedimentation of debris and so on. You destroy, basically you erase the habitat. And many other habitats linked to recreation, to cattle, which is watered, so cattle tramping and a night nutrient enrichment with the droppings of the cattle. and also non-native springs introduction. To choose some example, this is particularly evident with my long-term co-worker Abdullah Saber from Cairo University, Ain Shams University in Egypt. He was working in we were working together in the oasis of Western Egypt, and here these oases are fed by a huge groundwater system. That's the Nubian aquifer system or Nubian sandstone system. And wells, more and more wells are placed in this system, and they go down deeper and deeper. And unfortunately, they almost start thinking now of sustainable development plans, but that's still in the very infancy. And so you can see these curves that show that the wells go up and the natural springs fall dry and disappear and go down. So we wrote in 2020 this urgent plea for global protection of springs, identifying 4 key objectives for spring protection. The first one is to raise in the scientific milieu, but even more important in the society, in the communities, public awareness of spring and recognition of springs as separate systems from lakes and rivers and streams, that they are really a special entity, ecosystem, that they should be included in relevant legislation. That's still the case only in very few places. It happens in Australia, in Finland. In Europe, it's very strange because only the petrifying springs are adequately recognized by the Habitat Directive, and not all the other springs, which are as well or even more important. Develop guidelines and collaborative efforts to promote spring science and stewardship, and develop scientifically sound and scientifically proven methods for spring restoration and sustainable use. So let's come to the topic. I want to talk about biodiversity, or to the core topic, biodiversity, especially diatom diversity in springs. They are systems with high diversity, but we will see more precisely in which sense high and at which conditions. And here you can see Larry Stevens. He is also in the southwest of the United States and northern Arizona, and he now has an independent institute, very important for our topic, Springs Stewardship Institute, which has at the core of its mission to advance the stewardship and science of springs. So many things I am telling you were refined by many talks and listening to lectures by Larry. And here is an example of spring richness. We had a project in the southeastern Alps, and with Crenodat, we looked at almost all groups, excluding heterotrophic bacteria, almost all groups, and we found, you see, large number of species for almost all groups. That's detail, but I put in this slide because it was one of the situations leading me to develop this concept of springs also as living repositories of biodiversity. And here the practical thing is that Bohemia on benthic cyanobacteria, cyanoprokaryotes, and currently in the genus Camesiphon, which is important in springs. And I had to collect in a short time fresh material to send to them to try to sequence it from single cells. And in a very short time, I could decide on the basis of the ecological preferences of these species where I could have springs that were likely to host populations of these cyanobacteria I was looking for, and I could go there, I found them, and I could collect fresh material in a very simple, in a very quick time. And so in a way, I think, well, I am using these springs almost as a living culture collection where I can take materials. And I still do it today to prepare lectures and labs at the university. I go to the right spring and I take, it can be cyanoprokaryotes or diatoms or even ferns or bryophytes. So springs are rich in species. They are often called also biodiversity hotspots. And some of these species are there because springs offer them shelter. There are different types of relicts, and springs are refugia for them. One example that also helped me to develop this concept of springs as living repositories, in this case really of diatom biodiversity, is this incredible volume by Marcus Verum and Horst Lange-Berthelow. They studied hundreds of springs, mostly in the surroundings of Frankfurt, but which is an area with diversified geology. And in this study, they could find as much as 52% of the diatom flora known for Central Europe at that time. So overall, they can, if you study a number of different springs, different kinds of springs on different lithological substrates, you get very high numbers, and these systems really can contribute as repositories of diatom biodiversity. And we changed the name of this concept by Botojaneanu of another type of relict. Botojaneanu called these relicts geographic relicts, but lecturing in the Czech Republic, I realized that this was a source of confusion for the students because they were correctly thinking more of some of glacial relics, of things like that, thinking on the geography. But what Botojaneanu meant and what we redefined for clarity was that in territories which are densely populated and heavily exploited, the most sensitive species, including diatom species, can survive only in the aquatic habitats which are least impacted. And these typically are springs. So we call this LIHRe, and this would mean least impaired habitat relicts. And indeed, with a PhD some years ago from Switzerland, we could show that really in Switzerland, comparing to large databases of springs and streams, we could show that the springs act as refugia for the most sensitive species, and also for red list species. There is a beautiful paper that by Larry Stevens and Cartwright and co-authors and several collaborators on springs as climatic and hydrologic or hydraulic refugium for spring organisms in the face of climate change. Of course, if they are stable, they can be a lasting refugium, a stable refugium. Otherwise, they can be only, if they are unstable and maybe intermittent, desiccating from time to time, only a transient refugium. And this is an image, it's just, I just use it to, because I hope that it can be evocative of, even if you study a relatively small territory, but this is Northern Apennines with a very complex and diverse geology. you can see you have very different types of aquifers and of flow paths or flow system, groundwater flow systems. So there is a diversity, hydrogeological diversity, which translates in hydrochemical diversity, because there is also lithological diversity. You can see that on all the colors, looking at all the colors on the map of, this is Trentino, Southeastern Alps, on this geological map. So many lithological types, hydrogeological diversity, hydrochemical diversity. This translates into biological diversity, especially the diatoms, which respond in a very effective way in the absence of impacts and nutrients enrichment. They respond in a very effective way to geogenic variables like pH, conductivity, mineralization. And here there is the example of Acanthidium dolomiticum. The name is because it was found in the Dolomites, of course, but it's also because it's found in basins which have an above water with an above average concentration of magnesium, which comes from the dolomite rock, which is a double carbonate of calcium and magnesium. There are also higher plants, like with this beautiful Gentiana brenta, endemic of the Brenta mountain group, that does the same thing. It stays only on dolomitic rock. And this even at the intraspecific level, we have reactions to specificities of the rock type or to contaminations. And in this case, we could use a very special and in some cases very slight type of teratology that we call Cymbeliclinum-like teratology, with which these deformities are a sign, a signal that diatoms are reacting to above average concentrations of copper, zinc, and a very special element in this case, it's also antimony. In that case, you got a double teratology, both ends were bent off. And so this antimony. So very specific reactions by our diatom friends. And so here we try to look a little bit more precisely to this concept that springs have high biodiversity, and we concluded that they have high biodiversity at the landscape level. So more precisely, this high biodiversity is gamma biodiversity. And so here in this territory of the Northern Apennines, I already mentioned, we noticed the high hydrogeological diversity of aquifer and groundwater flow systems, the high lithological diversity, which translates in hydrochemical diversity, large hydrochemical gradients, which translates again in high diatom. In this case, we used the invertebrates and the vegetation with focus on water mites, which are very special in springs. I will tell you why later, and the diatoms, which of course are so sensitive indicators. And they both had high overall regional biodiversity, landscape level biodiversity. So let's go more into detail. We were saying there are some species, go more into detail of this biodiversity. How is it composition? We have seen some relicts. There are also newly described species in springs, still after now many or some decades of several people working on also diatom taxonomy in springs. They are still new genera and species are described. Here there are two examples. I already mentioned Acanthidium dolomiticum. Interestingly, Acanthidium dolomiticum is not only a good indicator of magnesium, but it's also a characteristic species of springs with fluctuating discharge. And which even have intermittent discharge, so desiccation from time to time. That's very useful in hydrogeology, so in the eco-hydrogeological approach. So new species, and here we even described a new genus from a spring. It's also in Myers, and it's not by chance found in the spring times which are closest to Myers, and it's the genus Microfissurata. But in springs, you will not find new genera only of diatoms and benticalgi, but also of animals, here invertebrates, the water mites, the new genus Brentelebertia was described during this Crinodat project that I mentioned, and in many other groups you can find new species. And that's something here where diatoms do very well. And I have been working now and using, at least, maybe not working, but using in my scientific work, the Diatom red list by Horst Lange-Berthel, which exists since 1996 in many aquatic environments. And recently, 2018, the new version of this list was published, and it's very sound because it's based on 11,000 stations of the German monitoring network, where they sample diatoms and measure all environmental or many environmental variables. And we could write this recent paper to show how useful this Diatom red list can be, or Diatom red list can be, but we need regional ones in environmental and ecological integrity assessments and monitoring. We could even find a quantitative, statistically significant relationships between the nitrate, one of the main stressor nitrates, concentrations, and the cumulative percentage of diatom species which fall in threat categories of the red list. So we find very high numbers of threatened diatom of red list species, diatom red list species in springs. And another thing I am often asked when I go to meetings of spring specialists is if there are diatom species which are exclusive of springs. Because it's a big issue in spring biology. In spring biology, they define cranobiontic species, or the name, the more recent English name is simpler, springs dependent. So springs, so species which live only in springs. And then they define in spring biology cranophilous species, species which live in springs and in habitat with similar ecological characteristics, and crinoxenic springs, so species which appear in springs only occasionally, but actually are not directly related to the spring habitat. So I am always very cautious about diatoms being specifics for springs, because I think they are specific to hydrochemical, ecological niches or micro niches, not so much for the specific habitat type at this level. But still, we will see that maybe one diatom could be endemic, because endemism is similar, but it only partly overlaps with spring exclusive species. And it's a big issue in spring biology again. For example, in Australia, they have a great artesian basin, and they have glory stories, record waters that are as old as 2 million years. And in these places where these ancient waters come to daylight, in artesian springs, in oases, in the desert, there are strictly endemic species, mostly of animals, but also of higher plants, where there is also a grass described as endemic from these and the cyanobacterium. But with diatoms is more difficult because, you know, they, of course, they have a biogeography, but this biogeography becomes prominent, important only if the sites are distant between them more than 500 kilometers or 1,000 kilometers or so. They need a large distance. And where the geology is very special, like in New Caledonia, which is also a very isolated place, there you find many endemic diatom species. For example, here 50 species, many endemic, or almost all endemic on New Caledonia. So maybe here in this Montezuma well, we can indeed find a diatom that, well, according to the current level of knowledge, it is considered endemic because it's known only from this site, but that's a very special site. It's probably the point with the highest number of endemic species in North America. There is also water scorpion, leeches, endemic leeches, even a genus, which are endemic from this site. But it must, again, be said that it's also a site with a very special hydrochemistry because it has very hard water, carbonated, but also with a kicker of arsenic. So it's poisonous for living beings which are not specifically adapted to this environment. And unfortunately also to the native people who use the water for their fields with ditches and for their vegetables, and had to cope with this high arsenic concentrations. But my idea still is that more than the spring environment for the diatoms, it's the special hydrochemical niche that selects the species. And so if there might be a similar place on Earth somewhere else, maybe our Gomphonaema montezumense might show up there. This slide is also to talk about extremely isolated springs and connected springs. There is a whole range of situations, and here we have these two extremes with diatom examples. We have the endemic or supposedly endemic Gomphonaema montezumense. And here, on the contrary, there is this Cimbella tridentina, which I described some years ago from southeastern Alps, from the Adamello Brenta Nature Park. And it is in the spring mouth, but also in the spring-fed stream. Luckily, on the locality, on the type locality, I had done a longitudinal distribution study. So I knew that it was distributed in the spring head, but also in the spring-fed stream, in the upper part of the spring-fed stream. So it's a typical indicator of headwaters, of spring-fed headwaters in a connected surface running water system. And in this slide, we also have a negative, let's say, thing that with again, with a diatom example, because among the impacts, we mentioned non-native species. And we could find this non-native marine coast species, Ligmophora normaniana, in a spring in the Siwa oasis in the western desert of Egypt, so hundreds of kilometers far from the coast, the Mediterranean coast. And probably got there because people are using the spring to breed marine and estuarine fishes, and that's how the diatom could have reached this isolated, otherwise theoretically isolated inland water. So we have talked about biodiversity, especially diatom biodiversity in springs, and now I would try to say a little bit about the causes, the grounds of this biodiversity. And of course, as ecologists, we may start with the environmental drivers, and they are different for every biological group. But of course, we want a diatom example. And here we see that the drivers are very similar to those that we find would find in other aquatic environments. There are nutrients, nitrates, and of course, geogenic variables, pH, mineral content of water, the light conditions, and also the flow, the current velocity, and things like that. Well, this helps me to remember that by chance, recently both me and Larry Stevens published chapters in encyclopedias. Larry published a chapter in the Encyclopedia of the World's Biomes, even proposing that springs on Earth may constitute a biome. And I published a chapter in the Encyclopedia of Inland Waters. And these chapters may be useful for those who want a summary of an updated summary about springs science. And but this slide with this image from my chapter about these basic spring types is actually are paintings by Wilhelm Bruck, which is a German painter and my grandfather. And he painted the spree happened, it wasn't on request, but he happened to paint the three basic spring types. So the flowing springs, also known as rheocrines, and the seepages, helocranic springs, and the pool springs, limnocranic springs. But there is much more diversity. There is a number of spring types that we can recognize. And there was a classical work done in North America by Abe Springer and Larry Stevens, and published 2008, the spheres, their famous spheres of discharge. And they recently updated it with a great paper in ecological applications, where we distinguish 14 spheres of discharge, and also separate the anthropogenic artificial springs from the natural ones, and palo springs from the existing current time springs. And here we don't need to go into the detail, but it's just the important concept is there is a lot of diversity also in the ecomorphology of springs. And this, since we want to stay with the diatoms, there are very many ways we can approach identification of spring types or definition of spring types, kinds of springs, and we can do it with the diatoms, of course. And this is part of an example of spring types in the southeastern, well, in the Alps in general, obtained with diatoms. It's a paper of 2012. And that's on the same springs, but a nice way to approach, if you want, you can use functional traits, you could use, of course, morphology, chemistry, hydrogeology. But if you want to use biological groups, a nice way is to have a or theoretically it would be a nice way to have a multi-taxon approach. But the problem there is that every biological group will tend to tell its own story. We had here some congruence between the diatoms and the vascular plant, the bryophytes, between groups of the meiofauna, and between caddisflies and stoneflies. But otherwise, every group has special requirements and will tell you about its special kinds of spring types. But that's also the beauty of natural history and biology. So multi-taxon approach. And as I am trying to convey this concept of incredible diversity of spring habitats, spring ecosystems, there are also, we were focusing in the talk on terrestrial springs, but there are also underwater springs. So springs that emerge under lakes, under rivers, and under seas and oceans. Especially the freshwater discharge at the continental margins is very important and creates very special biotopes that are beginning to be more intensively studied only today. So going back to this incredible diversity of springs, we have seen underwater. So let's go back also to the desert springs. I already mentioned them several times in the talk, but the springs in arid lands, in deserts are very special. They form oases many times. And these oases are also places of incredible, not only natural, but ecological systems with high biocultural diversity. And especially Rod Fensham, a colleague from Australia, from a Queensland University, has done a lot of studies. And he recently has started with this great initiative, a fellowship of a spring, where he's collating thousands of data about springs in arid lands with the help of people interested in these ecosystems worldwide. And his aim is not only to put together scientific information on these springs, but also to help spring studies to be developed, especially in countries that don't have good economic means for scientific research. And of course, thermal and mineral springs are very special types. The thermal springs are rarely found in natural conditions because they are used almost always in spas, and there are infrastructures on them. In mineral springs, there is a wealth of different types. And here I am again mentioning the limestone precipitating springs, and more famous maybe as petrifying springs, because there is, I already mentioned briefly, this special and strange, in a way, situation in Europe that only the spring type is included and protected by the Habitat Directive of the EU, whilst all the other spring types are not included and considered worth enough of protection, while they're even more important. In these limestone precipitating springs, maybe one of the most characteristic algae is a desmid, a very strange desmid that makes a beautiful carbonate cup in which the cell sits, and it's this ocardium. But there are also quite interesting diatoms with special assemblages, communities related to limestone precipitated springs, including, for example, Gonphonema latericuntatum, Denticula elegans, and this Acanthidium trinode, and several others. Talking about the ways in which diversity builds up in springs, also microhabitats within single spring are very important in this regard. And for example, here we have this nice image taken again by a work by Larry Stevens, with one of the updated spring classification in ecological applications. And here in this beautiful Thunder River spring in Grand Canyon, Arizona, he identified a dozen of microhabitats in this large spring. And this mosaic patchwork nature of springs was understood and recognized already by Ili and Botojaneanu in their paper of 1963, when they defined crinobiology, so special discipline of springs biology. Looking at diatoms, we find in springs substrate specific or taxa which have a very clear microhabitat substrate preference. But we also could show, working on springs, that if you do a variance partitioning, the influence of the environmental factor is much larger compared to the substrate, to the microhabitat. So we have said, tried to say about the diversity in spring, biodiversity in springs, the features, the special types of patterns and features of this diversity. Just a few slides to mention how we can use this present and past diversity. In this case, historical approach with paleolimnological or paleochronological approach, also in springs sometimes it's not so common, but you can have undisturbed sedimentation places, and so you can take a sediment core, and that's what we did here, and we studied it, and we could show environmental change, in this case mainly anthropogenic, related to the building of a street and changing in water level of this limnocranic, of this pool spring. And of course you can use springs as nice sites, sentinel environments nowadays for environmental and mainly climate change, as monitoring sites over the long term. And since beginning of the 90s, in some springs of the South Eastern Alps, I am doing some monitoring, of course, considering hydrochemistry, and diatoms, but also invertebrates, but mainly diatom-based monitoring. And in this part of the Alps, in several of these monitoring sites, we have holocrystalline granitic rocks, which are have very low solubility, so the water has a very low buffering capacity, and they are very sensitive to any acid precipitation. But luckily, they are not acidified. But still, alkalinity is naturally very low, and one, let's say, positive effect of climate change is that higher temperatures at high elevations have caused, among other things, an increase in dissolved minerals in the water, so that alkalinity is slightly increased. And the diatoms are very nicely, even these are small, if these are small changes, the diatoms are nicely showing this. And here you see a change in dominance between two eunocia species that are typical for two different levels, or slightly different levels of alkalinity. So I think I made my points. I tried to talk about biodiversity, especially diatom diversity in springs, to show the patterns and the features of this diversity, the type of organisms that build up this diversity. We have seen, we have newly described genera and species, rare species, red list species. We have sometimes maybe endemic species, springs dependent, so exclusive species, very special types of biodiversity. And we try to understand the reasons for this, probably the simple and main reason just being the diversity of environmental situation offered by this type of ecosystems. And I tried also to point to the importance of eco-hydrological approach, which combines approaches from ecology and hydrogeology for the understanding of spring ecosystem functioning and their biodiversity. So thank you for your attention. Thank you to the organizers of steering board of the Diatom Web Academy for inviting me for this talk, and to Larry Stevens and many other springs scientists and friends for inspiring talks and discussions on which in part also this talk was based. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Marco. I have to ask you one quick question right off the bat. Did you say that your grandfather painted the 3 different spring types?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful.
Yes.
Did he paint a lot of springs? Do springs flow through your family?
And well, it was at that time, he didn't know that they would be important, let's say, in my scientific career. Yeah. But he was really fond of nature and all manifestations, and he was painting different types of landscapes and also other things, but he really loved painting landscapes. And by chance, I had this, among some of his paintings, I had also this 3, and they happened to show the 3 basic spring types. So I like to use them for a different representation of types.
Yeah, that's a wonderful connection, and they are very pretty. I can't wait to see the book or see a replication of the publication so I can see them again. But that was very, very nice. Sarah Spalding had a question for you. And she was curious if you could elaborate on a statement you made that habitat isolation is often better than habitat connectivity.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's maybe again a sentence that I captured in one of Larry Stevens' talks, and he said, I think precisely, connectivity is not something we would like to see in springs, which maybe I can understand Sarah's question, because probably many running water ecologists would be disappointed by a statement of this type. But Larry said that because he just mentioned the many invasive non-native species in springs, especially of the southwestern United States. And the reason why these invasive species are able to reach the springs is that they are connected to a surface running water system. If they are isolated, it's a kind of natural protection against these non-native invasive species reaching them. So
until somebody wants, until somebody wants to have a fish farm in the middle of the continent, right?
Exactly. I was about to say that even if you are in the middle of the desert, you would be naturally protected. But if someone decides to raise fishes,
great. Yes, thank you. So another question. Let's see. I'm trying to remember the order I wanted to ask them. Okay, so here's a question about hydrothermal springs. Mm-hmm. Have you seen springs, or maybe even not just hydrothermal, but a specific environmental condition that results in a monospecific assemblage, essentially, or a spring condition that's dominant by one diatom or even alga?
Actually, a reduction in diversity I have seen in some sites, but not really monospecific. So not so strong reduction. So some specific taxa selected. For example, I got some materials from Algeria. There was a visiting at that time PhD student coming, and now she will probably soon come again to Bologna as a also for a short training. And she had very nice. They had very nice thermal springs, which some reach pretty high temperatures, even 70 degrees Celsius. And there are around them, in spite of the high temperatures, diatoms. Of course, there are belts. And normally in the very hot spot, there are cyanobacteria and other bacteria. And then as it gets a little bit, temperature gets a little bit down, you get other algae, and among them, a lot of diatoms. And there are several Calonae species were prominent and interesting. We are still studying those. But I don't remember really monoculture of some diatom. And there was a review paper of some years ago on diatoms in hydrothermal springs by Pat Kocholek and Russian colleague. And so there is some knowledge on diatoms in these.
Yeah. Yes. And Sumaya kind of had a question building off of that. When you look at thermal spring, I guess people are very interested in thermal springs. When you look at thermal springs, maybe at the continental level or even the global level, do you see the springs being more similar at one geographic level, or are they affected by local environmental conditions and they're very heterogeneous?
Actually, I don't have own sufficient experience to answer this question, because I have done some sporadic studies. For example, I had a doctoral student, co-supervised doctoral student from Sardinia, and she did several diatom spring studies, and among these we studied also thermal springs in Sardinia, and Zona, large Mediterranean island. But these are not enough cases to be really able to say. I know that they are a lot in the focus. I'm doing with many others literature study, broad literature study on literature on springs. And in the last 2 to 3 decades, there has been a real explosion on studies on thermal spring microbiology, because that's very much linked to the development of modern barcoding, metagenomic techniques that allow, actually before with morphology, it was very difficult to properly study, and also with cultivation methods and these things, it was quite difficult to have, and now it's relatively easy to have a very precise overview of at least of the number of species and the diversity, microbial diversity in thermal springs. And so they use them really as model systems for biogeographical questions, because normally actually they span as systems, they span very wide gradients of pH, goes from very acid to extremely basic, and thermal gradients are also very strong. But still they offer kind of islands with relatively homogeneous situation all over, present all over the world. And so they are test environments for many biogeographical theories.
Yes, and that's maybe if the isolation is truly maintained and there's not a lot of introduced, migrations, then you do have the benefit of studying these little ecosystems that are all separated. I have one last question for you. I know just in my own ecological work of getting out and working on rivers and wetlands, there are quite a lot of springs out there that at least in the United States, and from a regulatory point of view, nobody's paying attention to them. Do you have any advice or tips on how to get people, maybe even regulators, interested in springs?
Yes, that's what we try to write also in this urgent plea for the global protection of springs. And the first step really is to get the general public and hopefully as a consequence also decision makers, politicians aware of springs. First step is spatial independent ecosystems, because sometimes they are just mixed up with other type of ecosystems. For example, when we wrote this urgent plea, one of the reviewers of the paper said, but some springs are already included in the Ramsar Convention. That's a nice convention, but it's about wetlands. And some springs are included because they are in large wetland sites. And so there is no recognition of springs as special habitat systems that deserve protection on their own merits. And that's important, because if this is not understood, of course, there will never be specific legislation, and that can be a basis for practical protection, conservation measures. So that's the first step. And unfortunately, globally, there are only very few countries that have a specific legislation for protection of springs. Australia has something, and Finland, but not so many. And there are curious situations. I remember a colleague telling me that I think Wisconsin recognizes springs only if they have more than a certain discharge, which is quite a relatively large discharge, and they must have brown trout. So if they don't have trout, they are not recognized, officially recognized as springs. And so, yes, there need to be a better understanding, general understanding of springs as important ecosystems for aquatic biodiversity conservation. and all for all the ecosystem services they provide that I try to briefly show, so that there can be an effective legislation and then effective conservation measures. And also very important, there are many springs because in most everywhere there is an important presence of men. Densely populated areas, springs have been used a lot, and even in mountains which are close to populated areas. And so there are many springs which now are captured, but these concrete capturing boxes are no longer needed, they are no longer used. And so there aren't that many studies, but again, Larry Stevens has done one nice restoration study, and he says that if aquifer is kept in good health, so if the water quality of the aquifer is maintained or restored, you have a great probability of having success even in restoration of a spring if you remove all these capturing infrastructures. And so there would be wide possibilities also to recover many of these ecosystems which have, especially from our diatom point of view, from a point of view of photoautotrophic organisms, they have been destroyed for, but probably the diatoms and the other algae, the cyanobacteria, they are still around in some nearby smaller spring, and if you restore the large spring, they will come back. And that's the way. And even when you capture a spring, there are sometimes it even needs just such a simple device as a flow splitter that you can use a part of the flow and keep it to have some natural or nature near discharge that you can make in an artificial, but it will be very similar to what was present in the natural emergence site. Sure. And you can create a secondary spring that will have many of the biodiversity values and functions, ecosystem functions that of a previous existing habitat. And so you can exploit the water and save also the natural habitat. So, but also all these reasonings are still in their infancy compared to restoration ecology in, I think, rivers and lakes. And so this needs to be much developed to give an important contribution to spring conservation.
Yeah, so to tie back, the science has shown us some of the things that we need to do in creating refugia. We can still use the water, but create refugia to maintain the biodiversity. We need to get people fired up and excited about springs, and I think
that's I try. I organize special sessions in larger meetings because you would think it's now popular, at least among limnologists, freshwater scientists, but well, it's to a certain degree.
Yeah,
we try with several others. I try again and again. We also the last year at the JASM and Joint Aquatic Sciences meeting in Grand Rapids, we organized a session on springs and to try to get them a little bit in the focus of attention of the colleagues.
Yeah, well, great, Marco. Thank you very much.